Hi, everyone. Welcome to Jacobin's stay-at-home series. Sorry, maybe that's not what we're calling it anymore, but Jacobin Talk tonight. My name is Jared Abbott, and we're here with two fabulous speakers. Dustin Guastella, who is a Director of Operations for Teamsters 623 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Rich Yeselson, who's a writer who worked for many years in the labor movement, is on the editorial board of Dissent, and is writing a book currently about the Taft-Hartley Act. And we're here to begin a debate that I tried to kick off in a contribution that I made in Jacobin's recent issue, which is fantastic, and everybody should go out and read immediately if you haven't already. The issue is basically a wide-ranging postmortem of the Sanders campaign, including amazing dialogues, which are super fascinating, between a number of the key Sanders staffers who are sort of reflecting on pretty candidly on how they saw the campaign at key moments as it unfolded. Also includes sharp analyses of where the Sanderista movement goes from here, from Matt Karp, Megan Day, Seth Ackerman, among many other great contributions in the piece or in the magazine. In my article, I try to tackle what I see as a key but unfortunately underexamined dilemma around the future of democratic socialist electoral organizing in the short to medium term. And in brief, I argue that the key debate we should be having right now is not whether or not to engage in electoral politics, is not whether or not we should participate in the Democratic Party. Today, all but the most diehard advocates of electoral abstentionism and the most committed third-party stalwarts agree that Sanders' movement has played a major role in putting the left on the strongest footing it's been on in decades, and that we have to take full advantage of the historic opportunity we currently have as a result of the COVID crisis and the massive uprisings that we've seen in the wake of George Floyd's killing earlier this year to pull US politics decisively to the left. If we play our cards right, despite the major uncertainty and extraordinary risk of right-wing resurgence that we currently face, we have a chance to build working class and popular power and press a left-wing policy agenda in the coming years greater than any we've seen since the 1960s, if not the 1930s. Yet, on the left, those who more or less agree with the assessment I've just offered have very different strategic visions for how to make this happen. On the one hand is a group I call the Confrontationalists. This includes many radical Sanderistas, DSA, and Jacobin people who want to continue Bernie's vision of building a new working class electoral constituency out of low propensity and non-voters by building a parallel organization that doesn't engage at all or very little with the formal structures of the Democratic Party. These folks seek to use the Democratic Party ballot line in a purely instrumental way to overcome the difficulties facing third-party challengers and ultimately hope either to stage a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party or to force a split that might yield a social democratic or labor-based party sometime in the future. On the other hand, there are folks that I call the coalitionists. This includes organizations like Justice Democrats, the Working Families Party, Our Revolution, and many others. These folks also want to challenge the dominance of neoliberal Democrats in the Democratic Party by primarying centrist Democrats and pushing the party further to the left. And in the case of organizations like Working Families Party, they even have their own formal party organization independent of the Democratic Party to do just that, but who, in general, see the need to build common cause with the rest of the Democratic Party and to convince other Democrats that various progressive policies are actually electoral winners that can serve them well at the polls. Further, while championing the causes of the multiracial working class, the coalitionists also view middle-class liberal voters and progressives who strongly identify with the Democratic Party as much more promising constituencies for victory than disillusioned, low propensity and non-voters in the working class. These folks generally see a realignment of the Democratic Party already taking place, at least to some degree, in the wake of the Sanders moment, and hope to gradually press as far in that direction as practically possible. Advocates of these two approaches, which are admittedly somewhat stylized, generally talk past each other and ignore or dismiss important challenging critiques of their strategic assumptions that are made by the other side. And I think this is a serious problem because engaging in reflection and constructive debate along these lines can put us in a much stronger position to advance democratic socialist politics in the coming period. So that's why we're here. And I hope in future debates that follow to continue this discussion, our goal is to make the strongest possible case for each of the two perspectives and force partisans of each side to engage directly and honestly with the strongest critiques of their approach. So along those lines, we'll first have Dustin and Rich lay out as clearly as possibly and as specifically as possibly what they envision as the sort of 5 and 10 year or sort of short to medium term strategy and goals of left electoral organizing, how achieving those goals will put the left and working class movements in a stronger structural position to win stronger social democratic reforms that all of us want, and how having larger blocks of left elected officials can strengthen the work of the labor movement, social movements, etc., and that can in turn build larger constituencies for left and progressive politics in the future. After that, I'll ask a couple of questions to each, and then if we have a few minutes left over at the end, we'll try to take your questions. So please send them in, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So with that, why don't we kick it off? Welcome, Dustin and Rich. Thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to talk with you. So I think maybe we can start with Dustin, and then maybe talk for about 10 minutes and sort of lay out your theory of the case, so to speak, and then we'll sort of turn it over to Rich, and then I'll ask some follow-ups after that. So take it away, Dustin.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks, Rich, and everybody at Jacobin for hosting this. I think it's an important talk, and hopefully we will have many more to come. So as Jared said, I'm going to try to lay out the case for what he calls confrontationalism. I'm not sure I think it's as confrontational as that might sound, but nonetheless, it is a distinct way of approaching elections and a way of approaching engaging in democratic primaries. And I'm going to try to explain what I think that method is and that strategy is. But before I do that, I want to lay out the goals, right? So for me, in 5 years, I would like to see that Medicare for All is an electoral winner in purple or even red districts. I think this is key. I think we need to demonstrate that our policy program can win in districts that are traditionally understood as hostile to left-wing politics. And then in 10 years, I think it's not crazy, although very ambitious, to say that we should have 20 seats in Congress, representing a diversity of districts, not just deep blue coastal districts, not just California and New York and Chicago area, but all that are blue, purple, and red. We should try to have some representatives. And I think these representatives need to be sincerely devoted to Sanders's program, right? A real commitment to the kind of policies that Sanders advocated for in his 2 presidential campaigns. So how do we get there? First, I think to lay out my case, we have to do some very hard work, some work that's not going to yield immediate results. And that is building a thoroughly working class constituency. And by that, I mean 3 particular groups, statistical groups of workers that we need to aim our sights at. And the first is disaffected workers. Now, these are the hardest group to win. These are the low propensity voters that Jared talked about. There's this massive, massive constituency out there of people who don't vote. And the truth is, what we know about them is they actually lean left economically. And if we can pull them in, this was Sanders' whole theory, if we can pull them in to Democratic Party primaries, they could vote for our candidates. I think despite our failure to do that in the Sanders campaign, it's a worthy goal and it's a necessary goal. If we want to win, I think that's one of the groups that we absolutely have to win over. And I think the case for this is, the New Deal coalition won a ton of workers who previously were not involved in party politics or were involved in party politics in a very different way. And the reason why we want to win them is not just for the pure numbers game, but it's also because when you can win this constituency, they become fiercely, fiercely loyal to your program. And so New Deal voters who were mobilized into the party system by the New Deal coalition, they became New Deal Democrats through and through. They were New Dealers from the start to the finish. Through every congressional election, they voted with the New Deal. That is what we want. We want a very loyal left-wing constituency. And I think that's the base that can make that happen. Why? They become loyal because you mobilize them into the political process. You were the group that said, here's how we do politics. And now you are the group that those voters trust. They don't trust the centrists. They don't trust the establishment, but they trust this new group that pulled them in. The other group of workers that we have to win over are rural workers, right? Districts that for a long time have not been particularly viable for liberals or left-wing candidates. But they are incredibly important for structural reasons. The reason we need to win these voters over is because if we don't, we can kiss the Senate and the Electoral College goodbye. It is the fact that the Democratic Party has a long-term structural problem in winning in rural districts. And if we don't try to solve that problem in a left-wing way, we are going to lose those seats, and we are going to be locked out of those districts. And you can't form a government, even a tepid liberal government, if you don't have some of those districts. So we need to win rural workers. And finally, we have to win non-college educated workers. The truth is that the white whale of all center-left parties across the country is winning back the non-college educated vote. It was a vote that every post-war left-wing party had a lock on. That was their vote. They could count on it. And today, it is less and less and less true. The center-left is becoming parties of the highly educated, and they're leaving behind the traditional base of support, which once made the backbone of all of the social democratic reforms and the pseudo-social democratic reforms in the New Deal era. So we need to win back these non-college educated voters. We need to win rural voters, and we need to win a new constituency of disaffected workers. So it's a tall order. How do we do it? And my case is the way we do it is we have to organize candidates that are themselves coming out of both the non-college educated, the rural, and particularly the union movement. And if we can organize these candidates into party politics and not simply run progressives who tend to be college educated or who tend to be in districts that are dominated by college educated people, then we can start to tap into the constituencies we need to win in the long term. Second of all, we need to run on a platform that is bread and butter. It needs to be heavy on the economic policies. It needs to be heavy on the social democracy, jobs, healthcare, wages. These are the things that we need to talk about day in and day out in every district that we can possibly win. And we need to be, quite frankly, develop a serious message in these districts that can resonate with people. And for me, part of that is having candidates that come out of these districts, come out of these unions, come out of these communities. If we can do that, I think we have a lot of leverage that we can move forward, because what I'm suggesting is that we're going to be going up and competing against Republicans and hopefully beating them. If we can beat Republicans with a left-wing economic program, we've suddenly deflated the entire purpose of the Blue Dog Caucus in Congress. We've deflated the centrists' argument that they can do nothing on economics because it's just too far left for the electorate. And we've proven that our politics are an electoral winner in deep blue districts and in purple and red districts, which means it's an electoral winner for the balance of power in Congress. So I'll see the rest of my time. Hopefully we'll talk about it in the Q&A, but I think there are a number of strengths to this approach, and I will absolutely address what I think are the weaknesses to this approach. And I think there are several to this approach, but I think ultimately it is our duty to try to do this. We've got to win back this vote. We've got to win non-college workers. We've got to solve the urban-rural divide in center-left politics, and we have to be able to build a new constituency of non-voters if we're going to succeed in the long term.
Thank you, Dustin. So very clearly stated. Rich, response, or lay out your theory of the case.
Thanks, Jared, and thank you also for writing such a rigorously fair-minded, almost to a fault piece. It was like the anti-polemic, really pretty remarkable in how you laid out both sides so equitably. So my view is this. I think the goal of the broad left, which would include, some people who would call themselves liberals, some who would call themselves socialists, some people who call themselves social democrats, should be to do what the right-wing conservative movement did between, say, the end of the Taft era in 1952 and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and that's to take over the Democratic Party. I think this is doable for a lot of, I think, pretty obvious reasons. Party structure in the U.S. is porous. Like anybody can run anywhere, as Dustin was just saying. I mean, there's no reason we couldn't develop a cadre of working class candidates, perhaps associated with the labor movement, perhaps just emerging themselves from their communities, even without labor movement affiliation. The money issues, I think, are not what they used to be. Obviously, there's always going to be a donor class, a Wall Street corporate class that's going to fund both parties. But the technology that we now have on the internet, of course, means that left candidates can fund themselves too. Because as we know, Bernie raised a lot more money than anybody, including Joe Biden. So I think that should be our goal. It was a kind of a long march through the institution for conservatives, but they got there. I think perhaps we can get there quicker. And to answer the 5-year question, Dustin sort of sparked sort of how I would clarify it, because I think my cause and effect is different than his cause and effect. What I would like to see in, say, 5 years or 7, 8 years, 3, 4, 5 election cycles, is the Democratic, a very partisan, a hyper partisan Democratic Party, and I'll get to what that means and who has to help out with that, would be procedurally radical, procedurally aggressive, eliminate the supermajority filibuster in the Senate, add several states to the country, such as Washington, Puerto Rico, perhaps others, perhaps the islands, and with like this supermajority, pass a series of leftist policies that would then win back the trust of a very skeptical, primarily white working class, and that white working class sort of overlaps Dustin's categories. It's a lot of it actually is mostly rural. Most of the white working class within metropolitan areas is actually somewhat to the left of that in rural areas. You could call it, non-college educated. There's different categories there, but that group, both my reading, my talking, my own experience with that group is now, and this is much different than it was 50 years ago, but that group has become highly skeptical of government intervention. So I don't think you can just win them over by saying this is what we're going to do, even if we think what we're going to do is obviously great. I mean, great in a sort of broad, humane way, and just great in a leftist egalitarian way. Whether it's M for All or Green New Deal or childcare, or a whole bunch of like universal social democratic programs, essentially the Sanders campaign with a mix of Warren and of course the new leftists such as AOC and the rest of the squad. That it's not enough to say those programs are good. The mistrust is already baked in for a whole bunch of large historical reasons. So I think we've got to sort of do a workaround. We've got to like sort of hijack the system, use admittedly the incredibly anti-small d Democratic Senate and capital D too Democratic Senate to get a 50+ majority rather than a 60 plus majority, a supermajority filibuster, to sort of provide the policies that these these predominantly white working class people who are skeptical of government will then find very appealing. And that's how, to sort of, after their trust is won because the Democratic Party has delivered for them, and the left of an increasingly left Democratic Party has delivered for them, that's how they could then come over to the Democratic Party. And I think, like, and by the way, just a parenthetical here, in addition to people's life experience or other things they read, a really, really good book on this is a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin named Kathleen Kramer. She did a series of interviews all over Wisconsin. Her book is entitled The Politics of Resentment. She's native Wisconsin, went to school in Wisconsin, ended up teaching in Wisconsin. It's a tremendously in-depth look about, the complications of what people feel. And a lot of it has to do with an incredible skepticism that people in cities can do anything to help out people in rural areas like themselves. And it's a terrific sort of way to sort of prompt thinking about this. So I think what this is going to require from the left is, in fact, some kind of ownership of the Democratic Party. I don't think a hostile takeover is possible. I think takeover is possible, a majority takeover. But I don't, it's an old story. I don't think you can become the pastor of the church unless you join the church. So, one of the things I like that AOC does is she kind of owns the party. She's like a democratic socialist Democrat, capital D. She'll say our party or my party. And there's a strategic logic to that. That's not sentimental. It's not soft-headed, in my opinion. It's like basically saying, hey, y'all, I'm here too. And I get to make some decisions here too. And the people, and more importantly, the people I represent, the movement I represent, a new left gets to make decisions. That we are an increasingly strong faction within the party. Our power is growing. And this is our party, as much as it's like Nancy Pelosi's or Chuck Schumer's or Joe Biden's or the head of the DNC or any of that. This is our party, and we're going to fight within our party to pull it to the left. It's the exit voice loyalty thing with the social scientist Albert Hirschman spoke about, that rather than exit, you use your voice and, yes, some commitment of loyalty to like make changes. Like, this isn't working for us. We got to change. And so I think the way to sort of do that, that will sort of help us sort of get the program first and then bring along the white working class or parts of the white working class second, is to become partisan Democrats. Liberal centrists, will use Biden as a classic example here. He's still ambivalent about, actually fighting Republicans. And in fact, maybe he can make a deal with Mitch, and I don't know if he really believes that. He shouldn't, after, having spent 8 years as vice president. But essentially, the surveys show a lot of Americans find that very appealing. Of just the idea, hey, can't you all work together? Well, no, and this I think is an important thing for the left to understand too. The Republican Party, I think you have to make a sharp dichotomy. My thing is not so much coalition versus conflict or confrontation. It's dichotomous versus conflationist. And I think the left tends to be sometimes too much conflationist. This is just some neoliberal umbrella, and there's the left flank, there's the Democrats, a sort of left flank, and then there's the right flank, is the Republican. I think it's clear that what we have now, and this is way beyond Trump. In fact, this is what spawned Trump, is we have like the most dangerous reactionary party in the advanced world. It's a revanchist, bitter party. It's a combination practicing racial nationalists, a cross-class white alliance, meaning there are donor class people like Sheldon Adelson. There are small business people all over small towns in the country, family capitalists, as Steve Fraser calls them. And there are working class white people who share this racial nationalism. And then there's plutocracy and upward redistribution, anti-unionism, deregulation, huge tax cuts for the wealthy, for that donor class. That's the worst possible combination you can have. It's a dangerous class. It's a dangerous party. And for the Bidens of the Democratic Party, it's going to require rejecting this kind of namby-pamby, half-assed, we can work with these guys. No, you can't work with these guys. But for leftists, it's going to require them actually to be militant in a partisan way, not just in an ideological way, because they're going to have to get in there with the Democratic Party and push the Biden and Schumers in a partisan way. And so they say, look, we've got to bust the filibuster. We've got to get new states in the country so that there's the states that are likely to elect Democrats. In other words, procedural militants and sort of jumping in with both feet, the way AOC says, it's my party or our party, I think it's going to be the way to move the party to the left, and then subsequently to move the working class to the left. And I think, ultimately, that is not so coalitional in some ways, but in other ways it is. And maybe there's a bit of conflict in that too. And I'll stop now.
Okay, thank you, Rich. I mean, thank you both for those presentations. They were both refreshingly clear and offered a plausible theory of how we get from here to some kind of position where the left is actually able to be a meaningful player in U.S. politics and is able to pass the kinds of legislation that we need in order to put the left on even stronger footing down the road, as Rich was talking about passing progressive legislation that could then win back the working class in rural areas, white working class voters in the future. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways we could go in this discussion, but I think I would just throw out one question to each of you, and then we can. We're doing great on time, so and maybe a second, depending on how things go, and then we'll sort of open it up to questions from the audience. But for Dustin, I guess, I mean, I do appreciate the point that you made about, okay, there's a sort of long-term problem in terms of the Democratic Party's potential to be viable nationwide, especially in the Senate. And of course, you didn't mention, but also in state legislatures, in the 27 states that are run by Republicans currently. And if they don't have an approach to deal with that problem, we might end up being in a position where the Democratic Party, of course, under very different circumstances and very different ideological alignments, is similar to the way it was before the New Deal coalition, where it was a purely regional party and could not really compete nationally. My question for you is, you're basically saying these folks on an economic populist Bernie style program, we can win over these people in these districts, even in the absence of the kind of, big programmatic victories in terms of legislation that Rich is talking about. But, there's very little evidence that that's true. I mean, like if we compare the places in 2018, for instance, where you had Sanders style folks running in red and purple districts to, blue dogs that were running in red and purple districts, and certainly to Republicans that were running in those districts, the progressives have done really poorly. And just saying, as some people on the left do, which is true, that Bernie was, less unpopular among these folks than, Elizabeth Warren was in these districts, isn't really a theory of how you actually are competitive in a real way in those places. And so I'm wondering, what do you say to that? How can we even begin a process along the lines you're talking about when there seems to be so little empirical evidence that there is any chance to compete, not against the other progressives in the party. Okay, maybe we can do better than them in these districts, but can we really do better than Joe Manchin? Can we really do better than Kristen Sinema? Can we really do better than the Republicans? That's the question. So I wonder how you would respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rich's strongest case against what I argued is to say we can't win these voters until we win. And once we win and prove that we can actually deliver, that the state can deliver something to working class voters, there's not much we can do. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I mean, I think all of the data that we have shows Rich is more likely right than I am, right? But here's my counterpoint. I don't think we can win unless we try to win those voters. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we can actually implement the kind of policies we want to implement unless we win those voters. And so the way you learn how to win voters is you go out there and try to win them. Now, Jared's right. One of the most touted cases of this was Justice Democrats candidate Randy Bryce, an iron worker, iron stash. A very clear example of somebody who should have done exactly what I said he would do, right? Sweep up, be a left wing on economics, clean up and oust a Republican. He did worse than the centrist Democrats. He did worse than the basic, boring liberals that we all hate and like to claim that the working class hates. But the truth is about politics, you got to try. And the reason I think you have to try, and the reason I think we have to really invest in trying, is because I don't think the structure of politics as it is, where I disagree with Rich, is I don't think that we can win. I think that we are going to get sucked into a bubble of fairly educated progressives and liberals in hyper blue districts. And if we get sucked into that bubble, the Democratic Party becomes a regional party. Left-wing and liberal ideas become regional ideas, and they are not considered ideas that can govern the country nationally. And we will fail to actually get our policies across the finish line. And if we fail to do that, then we never even have a chance of saying, look, our theory of the case is right because we provided you health care or something like that. Now, the final thing I'll say about this is I think a lot of Rich's side of the debate, not to be too crude, but a lot of Rich's side of the debate comes down to an assumption that the young, college-educated millennial left is going to be consistently left-wing on the economic side of the debate. I am absolutely not convinced of that. I think a lot of what motivates those voters are cultural issues, and a lot of what motivates those voters are milieu issues, right? If that's the case, they're locking themselves further into an electoral ghetto. They are having a harder time reaching into parts of the country that don't have those kind of hyper-liberal views about defund the police or about, any number of things that many of the liberal champions and the new left are talking about on a national stage. And that becomes not just a low ceiling, but it becomes a real disadvantage in national party politics. So that's where I'll put it. We don't have the evidence. Jared, you're right. We don't have the evidence. But if we don't try, we're in a really tough spot because we are not in the position where the professional middle class is the majority of this country, by far. In fact, we're in a position where a far right winger who, if he talks about trade in a charismatic way, can sweep this country over, and the results will be very devastating.
I think we've already seen the results of that actually in the last few years. Rich, I mean, so Dustin, that's a great segue to the question I wanted to ask Rich, which is, I mean, it sounds like we're talking about a kind of a chicken or the egg problem here, right? Like, in order to win, we have to win first, but can we win first in order to win, right? And so my question for you is like, what incentive do party leaders, in the Democratic Party have to cede to progressive demands when they still are in this position of having to ensure that they can stay competitive in as many places as they possibly can stay competitive, which means, that they have to be pretty middle of the road on economic issues so that their, candidates, their centrist candidates, especially in the Senate, can still be competitive. this is the reason. This is one of the main reasons why they don't go to the left. It's not necessarily because of corporate influence, although that's a thing, of course, it's important, but they see the electoral writing on the wall that they have to compete in places that are more conservative. They have to compete in places that have a more diverse, in terms of ideological spectrum electorate than Republicans do. And so they worry that if they pass the Green New Deal, if they pass whatever, that they're going to get screwed and they're going to lose their 50 majority. And so basically, how do we think about changing the incentives that those party leaders have? Even with the most militant left you could imagine, AOC is doing a great job and obviously has done an amazing job sort of changing the national political discourse along with Bernie and others. But that doesn't mean that Schumer and Pelosi and the other strategists at the high levels of the Democratic Party are going to be willing to go in the direction that you're talking about, because there's a major electoral risk of doing that. And then I guess the sort of related question is, okay, the filibuster, how can we imagine a scenario where these party leaders would be willing to give up the filibuster when, time and time again, when they've had opportunities to do so in comparable moments in history, they've worried more about, a couple election cycles down the road when they could be used against them. And so they're just unwilling to give it up. So, how do you envision the sort of capacity of the left, or maybe just the corona crisis and the changing perspectives of the electorate in general after the massive Black Lives Matter protests that have roiled the country? How do you see those factors changing the incentive structures of the leaders of the Democratic Party to make your vision a reality?
Oh, it's all good questions, obviously. Let's just start with that last point about the filibuster. I mean, keep it. Well, there's a couple of things going on there. One thing is that these mostly guys, some women in the Senate, they like this gig where they can just sort of, like one of them could be the key leverage point, and they can stand up and sort of pontificate for a while, but nothing really changes. And there's like this status quo bias on one hand, but there's this premise that maybe they're doing something by the pontificating, but they're really not. In other words, they're as much afraid, some of them, of change as anything. However, we've already seen enormous changes in the filibuster in just the last 10 years. Recall that after the Republicans blocked the Democrats from filling 3 vacancies at the U.S. District Court in the 2nd District Court in the District of Columbia, the second most important court in the country after the Supreme Court, and blocked several executive branch appointments, including several to the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. Harry Reid said he had enough, and the Democratic Party said they had enough, and changed and eliminated the filibuster for judges below the Supreme Court and for executive branch appointments. So you can't filibuster somebody who's nominated for Attorney General now or Secretary of Treasury. And obviously that can cut both ways, because the Republicans can put in their ultra reactionary extremists, plutocrats, just as well as the Democrats can if they've got the power to. But the fact is that the Democrats did move forward then. Then the Republicans responded and eliminated the filibuster for the Supreme Court. So now we're in a position where the filibuster only still exists for legislation, for bills that could be passed. And the party is going to have a tremendous incentive, and there's going to be, I think, pent-up demand from, yes, a lot of the social democratic left, a lot of both this new left, I call them laborists, because, notwithstanding Dustin's remark, a lot of like urban young leftists who are post-grad have tried to organize and are organizing and successfully have organized unions in at their workplaces, whether it's an online publication or grad students. In other words, they're sort of, yeah, they are potentially PMC in training, professional managerial class in training, or junior PMC. But right now, I think they are an economically militant force, and that's based on their union organizing efforts. So I think those people are going to push hard. I think on voting rights, which I think we would all agree is procedurally and instrumentally a key into sort of accelerate and expedite the bringing into into the electorate of people who don't normally vote. I think, maybe I am being a bit romantic now, but I think the Dems actually really want to pass that. It's a kind of a homage to John Lewis on one hand, but it's also, even liberal Dems realize that they don't win unless turnout is large. And that's why that was the first bill that even the Pelosi-backed House of Representatives, Pelosi-led, House of Representatives, passed last year in the House. And of course, it died in the Senate, in McConnell's Senate. So my view is that the filibuster is up for grabs. As for the point about leadership worrying about, centrist or purple or center-right districts and states, that is a real concern. And I don't think there are any shortcuts there. I think the only thing, basically the only workaround there is for leftists to, this is where I actually basically agree with Dustin. Yeah, to run leftists like in primaries and see if some of those leftists win, and then and become party candidates, and then see if they can beat the Republican. But we are going to have to conjure with the fact that there's a huge hole now, where there used to be a large working class that was at least, liberal left, quasi social democratic left, represented by enormously large and by the standards of United States, powerful labor unions, the mine workers, the UAW, the steel workers, the electrical workers, that entire manufacturing, mining, and transportation. Don't forget about railroad workers, which barely exist anymore. There were over 1.2 million in 1950. That working class, manufacturing, mining, and transportation, barely exists anymore. There's only 8% of the country works in manufacturing anymore. In 1950, 700,000. There were 700,000 mine workers in the United Mine Workers. Now there might be 30,000, 40,000 mine workers in the whole country, union and non-union. There were more than that. There were 3 times as much as that, 4 times, in just West Virginia in 1940. Just West Virginia. So I think that is a huge hole, and we're all struggling with how to deal with that. And one part of it is there is a disproportionately more female and more non-white working class in healthcare, in caregiving, in retail, in warehousing, building service, food service. That is very powerful, and it's potentially, and it's certainly much larger now than what the remnants of the old working class. And that combined with, we'll call it the constituency of AOC, this more urban, multiracial, postgraduate but militant group, that's our base now. Those two. And, really, I don't think Dustin and I really disagree too much on this. The quandary is dealing with the white working class the only thing I'll say there, and I'm sorry, I'll close. I know I've been going on a bit, is that some of the regional stuff cuts Democratic way, or the left thinking about using the vehicle, the Democratic Party's way, and that you don't have to get 70, 80% of working class or 85% of union voters, which is what LBJ got in 1964, back when union vote was 30% of the entire working class. You don't have to get 80%. But if the Dems could get across the upper Midwest and a few other key states, get up to 50% of the white working class, 55%, hell, even 45%, which is a little higher than Sherrod Brown and Tammy Baldwin, who are supposedly really good, sort of liberal left populist candidates who appeal to white workers. You could get Sherrod Brown type people to 50% rather than 40%. That would be a lot. That would mean a lot. I admit that Appalachia and the South is a parts of the South, not the entire South. It's a harder nut to crack. But I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. There's a lot to say about both of your responses. If anybody has any questions, we don't have a lot of time left, but if anybody has any questions that you wanted to put in the chat, we'd love to at least briefly get to a couple. But I guess the obvious sort of response to quickly go back, so if anybody has them, please let us know. But to go back to Dustin briefly, I guess the obvious question there is like, what's wrong with what Rich just said? I mean, why not, take advantage of your strength as it currently exists in the Democratic Party to continue to win inroads in, very liberal urban places on the backs of, this coalition of the multiracial working class and sort of more middle class liberal voters. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, try, even though the Democratic Party establishment may not want to do it, to find as many decent candidates as you can to run in rural districts, and do it all through the kind of approach that groups like Justice Democrats and Our Revolution are already trying to do.
Well, I think there are two problems with it. One, I think, first of all, I'd like to say I think Rich and I actually agree on a lot more than we disagree on, and it's refreshing to have a debate in that vein. But I think there are two problems. One, I think Rich is discounting, or maybe not quite as familiar with my generation as I am, which is to say that I've started to become convinced that for many of the young millennial left, the bread and butter issues, which are electoral winners, are the add-on issues. They are not the heart and soul of what he calls the labor populists are pushing for. And I think there's a lot of evidence for this, and it's worrisome. And I think we have to take it seriously. Even Ocasio, who I think is a fantastic representative, and I don't want to, speak ill of her, the fact that she is not the face of Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic, it's worrisome. That's an issue that we have to deal with. And the reason why I think that's the case is not because they don't care, but it's because for them, much of what got them to the point, these urban deep blue districts, much of what got them to the point was a certain style of left-wing politics, right? And that style, to me, from my vantage point, seems more generational and more about ousting the old guard, getting rid of people who are not sort of representing their constituencies anymore in an aesthetic sense than it is about a kind of working class politics, right? So I think there's a tension there. And I think there's also a tension, which Rich doesn't quite get into, between, we talk about the service sector workers and the warehouse workers, but I guarantee you, if we run some of those warehouse workers and some of those service sector workers, they are going to run afoul of a certain sector of the millennial progressive left, because culturally they are very different. And it's not a question of race, as many people try to make it a question of race. Culturally, there's a very big shift among college-educated and non-college educated workers. And we have to figure out how to square that circle. So Rich is right in a sense that, let's have the big happy family, the big tent. But my fear is that one side of this tent, the highly educated side of the tent that lives in very deep blue districts, really doesn't understand what life is like for the other side of the tent, which is the non-college educated workers and those who don't live in deep blue districts. And until we can figure out how to square that circle, and I think that circle is squareable on a policy perspective, right? And then we've got a big 5 policy programs that everybody agrees are important. Medicare for all, free university tuition, $15 minimum wage, industrial policy, all these kinds of things are broad winners. But if the emphasis is one that is generational, one that is stylistic, one that is aesthetic, one that is highly interested in identity politics, cultural politics, political correctness, we're going to alienate that other side. And it's not just white workers. It's not just white workers. And this needs to get through people's heads. We are going to alienate many non-college educated Black and Latino workers as well. And we have to figure out how to square that circle. So from my perspective, it's not so simple as let's just do it all. Because I think that one side of this coalition could easily alienate the other.
Less than 10 minutes left, and we have a few questions here that touch on things that we haven't already gotten to. Rich, please.
Jared, yeah, just very quickly, because I know we should get to a question. This is just I just want to ask Dustin a question. This is just solely like a point of clarification question, so I understand what we're talking about, or in terms of the discussion. When you talk about the millennial left or new left and deep blue districts, are you talking about, it sounds like, Jared's article talked about, suburban, more sort of higher income PMC districts. But we've also talked in this discussion about, right, the quintessential kind of urban, no question, the urban, like sort of AOC kind of district, or even, the districts, of some of the other squad members in Boston and even Detroit and certainly Minneapolis. So are you talking about those leftist, new left types who are often in DSA or trying to organize their internet magazine? Or are you talking about the deep blue? Oh yeah, I guess I made a little funny there. Sorry. Or are you talking about the deep blue sort of suburban districts? Or are you talking about both?
Well, in that point, I was talking specifically about the AOC districts, because I'm talking about progressives more broadly, right? I'm talking about the sort of AOC squad left, and that is the millennial deep blue districts. And if we look at the data there, the truth is she didn't win among the non-college educated Black and Latino workers. She won among the very college educated, largely white professionals. And that is the constituency that I fear that we think is much larger than it is.
Okay, yeah, that's great. But I think in some level, Dustin, you're probably also thinking about, some of the more liberal middle class districts, because we hear different arguments about, but there's some overlap there for sure. But one thing that is that a person that asks a great question raises, which we haven't talked about, and which is pretty new to the last to this election cycle, is I think Matt Karp in his piece in Jacobin said we've now gone from the Patagonia Democrats, who are the middle class suburban liberals that you're just talking about, to the Halliburton Democrats, who are the never Trumpers, who are now in the Biden coalition. And and the person asks, how do these approaches interact with the fact that Trump appears to have pushed the white suburban, Republican voters into the Democratic Party camp, which their leadership has coveted for so long? So do you anticipate that group coming into the coalition will have any sorts of effects on the likelihood of the approaches that you've laid out, or are they just one and done, and then they're going back to the Republican Party? What do you think?
Rich, I'll let you take that because I already talked for a while.
This is a very interesting question, and Sam Moyne up at Yale recently wrote an article in the New Republic about this very issue, arguing that these never Trumpers, this Lincoln Project media thing, other sort of like not racist, at least Republicans or conservatives, are actually going to join with the center of the Democratic Party, the leadership, and turn to the left to crush the left, rather than organize a popular front to crush the proto-fascist or authoritarian right, which is obviously a big difference. And we and we know about this historically too, which way you turn there is kind of important. My view is this, that, for the very short term, for the purposes of just winning an election, you build a broad coalition. I can't remember the guy's name. This is my age issues, but remember when Bernie got an endorsement from whoever that guy, the radio guy, and there were a bunch of people got, that guy is a reactionary and all this. And all I'm thinking is, I suppose, on the margins, there are people you would never accept an endorsement from, obviously, various fascists and moral monsters. But there's like a wide 90% where if somebody wants to join your side, if they're a turncoat from their side, you take them, because you're trying to, in an electoral fight, trying to win. It's no different than a union fight. If the biggest asshole on the shop floor wants to sign a union card and fight for the union, come aboard, asshole. Maybe the union will change them, maybe the union won't. But you're trying to build as big a majority as you can. So I'm okay with all this, Kasich, Lincoln Project, all that. I will say after that, yes, there's going to be a fight. And, I would expect, or at least I would hope, because of that fight, because I think the left will push hard back, that a lot of those people will just not support the Democratic Party anymore. I tend to think that Biden will move not as much left as we want, but more to the left. I think, for what it's worth, he might be wrong, but Bernie seems to think that too. Maybe he's just hoping, but he seems to think that. And so I think that, people who are, essentially, upward redistributionists, they may be happy that, just an incredibly bizarre, peculiar grifter and a mentally erratic grifter like Trump is gone. But I don't think they're going to be able to take over the Democratic Party. And I don't think the party will move in their direction. But that's the dynamics of history before us. That's going to be a fight that's going to have to take place, which is also why I want leftists to become partisan actors in the Democratic Party, to join that fight against that center right group.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rich. Dustin, we're just about out of time, but if you have any last thoughts, then we'll sort of wrap it up. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, but we're at about time.
Yeah, I want to say, thanks, Rich. First of all, again, I think we agree more than we disagree. And I think on a lot of the issues, I think these kinds of conversations are important to figure out, where exactly, where the energy should be put. And I do want to say, my poo-pooing of the sort of gains that we've made is not an attempt to say we shouldn't be running these great progressive candidates in ultra blue districts, or we shouldn't be doing the kind of organizing we're doing in areas where we can make gains. I think we should absolutely be doing that. But one thing I think that we need to keep our eye on the ball about is the structural challenges that come with solving the rural-urban divide and solving the educational divide, right? That divide in American politics is very serious, and we need to figure out a way to solve it. And my fear, my big anxiety, is that we are going to fail to solve it in an effort to, move in a direction that concentrates specifically on what I might call the left-wing ghetto, which is, the already converted, we're capturing ourselves kind of situation. So I think we can do it. I think we can break out of that. I think we can get more voters on our side. I think that we can build out, and we can actually build a really strong movement of people primarying Democrats. But I think we need to be aware of that big challenge, and we can't sit satisfied consistently winning in the kinds of districts that the Democratic Party will never lose in. So we need to think through how we move forward. Lastly, I just want to say thanks, Jared, for hosting this. I think it's important. I think we need to keep talking about it. Neither of us have the answers, obviously. If we did, then we'd be in state power. But we're nowhere near having the answers. So we need to think through this kind of stuff. And I want to thank Rich for actually having a thoughtful approach here. And hopefully we can bang our heads together a few more times and come up with a strategy.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. I mean, it's very useful and engaging, and yeah, just a smart conversation. Right? Conversations. If conversations with power, we would have won already. But so far so good anyway.
Well, I want to thank you both very much, and everybody watching. It's been a great conversation. Like I said, I found it really refreshing the degree to which we were able to have a debate that was really grounded in a relatively dispassionate and objective look at sort of the power dynamics on the ground, which I think we need a lot more of in left electoral discussions. So I really appreciate that, and hopefully we can continue this going forward. And everybody should check out the new edition of Jacobin. It's very pretty, as always, wonderful content, and a lot of stimulating ideas to check out in there. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Take it easy.
Okay. Thank you, Jared. Thank you.